Your body was simply not built for the violence of a high G maneuver, because as hydrostatic pressure spikes inside your cardiovascular system during a sustained 9G turn, your internal organs begin a terrifying physical migration inside your torso. Blood behaves as if it has turned to molten lead. Your heart sags physically toward your pelvis as the pericardial tethers stretch under load, and your liver presses against a diaphragm that is already losing its mechanical range under the same load. We are going to walk through 5 parts that explain exactly what high G forces actually are in engineering terms, why your cardiovascular system fails gradually under sustained load, what physically happens to your liver and your diaphragm during the maneuver, why your lungs partially collapse in a phenomenon called acceleration atelectasis, and what the combined physiological ceiling means for the future of high-performance flight. G-forces in the engineering and physiological sense are accelerations expressed as multiples of Earth-normal gravitational acceleration. So 1G is what every human body experiences at rest. 2G is what an elevator briefly produces during a fast descent at the bottom of the shaft. 3 to 4G is what an amusement park roller coaster occasionally produces during the most aggressive transitions. And a modern fighter aircraft is structurally rated for sustained 9G operation with a fully suited pilot and is designed to be controllable under those loads. The F-22 Raptor, the F-35 family, the Eurofighter Typhoon, and the Su-35 all operate in this regime. And airshow and aerobatic pilots can briefly exceed 9G in certified aircraft with appropriate restraints, while space launch and re-entry profiles produce sustained loads in the same range with somewhat different biomechanical implications because of the trajectory of the acceleration vector. G-tolerance is not a universal human constant and varies across individuals in measurable ways. It varies with age, with fitness, with hydration, with blood volume, with training status, with breath cycle phase, and with whether the individual is using an anti-G suit at the time of the maneuver. USAF centrifuge training tolerates roughly 8 to 9G for trained, suited pilots for sustained periods, with documented peaks above 9G lasting only seconds before gray out, tunnel vision, or G-LOC sets in. While untrained, unsuited humans lose effective consciousness in the 4 to 6G range during sustained exposures that they have not been specifically conditioned to handle. The differential between what a trained and equipped pilot can do and what an untrained body can survive is what decades of pilot training, of G-suit engineering, and of physiological research have been designed to close, and the closure is partial. There is an absolute biological ceiling that no amount of training has yet exceeded. The first of our 5 main parts covers the hydrostatic invisible hammer that acceleration swings through the cardiovascular system, because this is the mechanism that produces every other downstream symptom in the chain. When a jet enters a high G turn, the airframe experiences 9 times the gravitational force it experiences at rest on the ground, and the pilot sitting in the cockpit feels this as a sensation of being pressed down into the seat, with 9 times their normal body weight distributed through every contact surface. To the body, this is functionally indistinguishable from gravity, because blood, organs, and tissues respond to it with exactly the same biological machinery they use to manage posture and circulation at rest, without any major modifications. The body's circulation and respiratory systems were not, however, designed to operate at 9 times the load they evolved for. For the entire evolutionary history of hominids, the maximum sustained acceleration any human body ever experienced was the gentle slope of a hillside or the brief deceleration of a fall, both of which are well below the threshold at which the cardiovascular system begins to fail. Hydrostatic pressure in the cardiovascular system rises linearly with G load, and the effective weight of the blood column from head to heart rises accordingly. So at 1G, the pressure gradient between the heart and the brain is small enough that the heart easily maintains cerebral perfusion without any kind of compensation. At 9G in the head-to-foot direction, the pressure gradient becomes mathematically equivalent to having a 9 times taller column of blood between the heart and the brain, which mechanically defeats the heart's pumping capacity almost completely and produces the physiological cascade that leads to loss of consciousness within seconds. The image of blood behaving as if it were molten lead is metaphorical in wording, but not inaccurate in direction. Blood does not become denser at high G because its mass is unchanged, but the effective gravitational load on a fixed volume of blood rises with the G load, and the hemodynamic effect is the same as if the blood were physically heavier than usual. The blood pools downward with great force. It stalls independent circulation in the lower extremities, and it resists the heart's ability to lift it back through the thorax to perfuse the brain. And within seconds of a high G onset, the pooling pattern is visible in imaging studies as blood mass shifting from the central circulation into the lower extremities and away from the brain. The progression is well documented and predictable. Peripheral vision dims first as the retina loses perfusion. The visual field then narrows from the periphery inward in the classic gray-out pattern. The field shrinks further towards central vision in the tunnel vision pattern. Central vision then dims in the blackout pattern. And finally, unconsciousness ensues in what aerospace medicine calls G-LOC, which is gravity-induced loss of consciousness. The second of our 5 main parts covers the descent of the vital core, the mechanical displacement of internal organs under high G load, which is in physiological terms a real and significant effect that is more dramatic than most lay summaries of high G physiology suggest. The liver, which is a large and dense organ suspended from the diaphragm and from the inferior vena cava via its suspensory ligaments, shifts downward under sustained high G load in measurable amounts, and the same is true of the spleen, of the kidneys, and to a limited extent of the heart itself. The heart, normally suspended in the mediastinum by the pericardium and by the great vessels, sags under 9G load toward the pelvic direction as the pericardial and vascular tethers stretch, and the stretching itself becomes a measurable phenomenon in imaging studies under sustained high G exposure. Imaging studies of human subjects under centrifuge loading, including echocardiography and MRI-compatible centrifuge research, have documented these shifts in detail, and the downward displacement is correlated with reduced venous return to the heart, because the inferior vena cava is partially compressed and partially kinked under high G loading in ways that the standing anatomy does not anticipate. Reduced venous return reduces cardiac output in direct proportion, and reduced cardiac output reduces cerebral perfusion in the same proportion. And this is the chain that produces almost every G-LOC event documented in the aerospace literature. Respiratory distress emerges as the organs press against the diaphragm from above in a mechanical effect that pilots describe vividly. The liver, the spleen, and the stomach, displaced and somewhat compressed by the high G load, transmit mechanical force into the diaphragm and reduce its range of motion in measurable ways. Breathing becomes mechanically harder at the same time. The cardiovascular system is failing to deliver oxygen efficiently to where it is needed, and pilots describe this combined sensation as breathing through a heavy object on the chest, which is anatomically accurate once the underlying mechanics of organ displacement under 9G loading are understood. The connective tissue stress under 9G loading is also substantial, because sustained high G pulls on the suspensory ligaments of the liver and on the pericardial connections of the heart, both of which are not adapted to repeated high-load cycles the way they are adapted to handle ordinary locomotion. While acute catastrophic rupture under a single maneuver is rare in trained pilots, repeated training exposures over a pilot's career are believed to contribute to cumulative connective tissue strain, particularly in the pelvic floor and abdominal wall structures that bear the load during peak G onset. The third part of this story covers the crushing of the pulmonary system in a phenomenon with a precise name: acceleration atelectasis, which is the partial collapse of the lower lobes that occurs under sustained high G load, and that drives most of the oxygenation crisis in sustained maneuvers. Under high G load, the lower lobes of the lungs partially collapse as the air within them is redistributed by the load vector, and the diaphragm's ability to draw air into the lower lobes is reduced by the abdominal organ loading described above in the second part. The lower lobe airways collapse under the transpulmonary pressure changes induced by high G loading, with the most affected areas being the lower lobes and the most dependent posterior segments of the lung, which is the same pattern of collapse seen in supine patients who have been lying flat for long periods. The result is a measurable reduction in functional lung volume and a corresponding reduction in the alveolar surface area available for gas exchange, and oxygenation drops sharply as the effective alveolar surface area shrinks in real time. Arterial oxygen saturation falls from above 95% in resting conditions to substantially lower values within seconds of sustained high G exposure, especially in subjects breathing air rather than supplemental oxygen, and pilots in normal flight operations breathe supplemental oxygen from the aircraft's onboard system precisely to keep oxygen saturation in the safe range under partial lung collapse conditions. The body's final defense against loss of consciousness under sustained load is the anti-G straining maneuver, AGSM for short, which is a coordinated physical maneuver the pilot executes deliberately to compensate for the cardiovascular failure mode. AGSM consists of a forced partial exhalation against a closed glottis, similar in mechanism to a Valsalva maneuver that anyone can perform in a quiet room, but executed under load and with specific timing, combined with sustained contraction of the skeletal muscle groups of the legs, the abdomen, and the chest. The dual effect of AGSM is to increase intrathoracic pressure, which impedes venous return, but raises arterial pressure above the heart in the direction needed to perfuse the brain, and to squeeze blood out of the lower extremity vasculature back toward the central circulation. And the maneuver is in the most literal sense a violent physical self-defense against the gravity vector that the pilot is using their own musculoskeletal system to fight. AGSM has very real limitations that any pilot will tell you about if you ask. It raises blood pressure substantially while it is held, but it cannot be sustained indefinitely because the human body is not built for continuous forced exhalation against a closed glottis. The forced breath hold phase is typically 3 to 4 seconds, after which the pilot must exhale and breathe, and the total cycle is rigid in timing, which means a missed cycle during sustained high-G maneuvering can produce gray out or G-LOC within a single breath interval. The maneuver is also physically exhausting, and pilots report significant fatigue after sustained 9G operation, even when the maneuver is held correctly throughout the loading period. And that fatigue accumulates across a sortie and across a training day in ways that affect subsequent maneuver performance. The fourth part of the story covers the mechanical survival straining package that modern anti-G suits provide alongside AGSM, which together form the standard high-end defense for modern fighter pilots, and which together produce roughly the maximum tolerance a human pilot can achieve under sustained load. Modern anti-G suits provide a complementary mechanical defense through inflatable bladders sewn into the suit that cover the legs, the abdomen, and sometimes the chest. And these bladders are pressurized during high-G exposure in synchrony with the G onset detected by the aircraft. The bladders mechanically compress the lower extremities and impede the blood pooling pattern that drives G-LOC. And modern suits like the U.S. Navy and Air Force CSU-22B/P and comparable European suits can provide roughly 1 to 1.5 G of additional tolerance, which at the margin is often the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness under sustained high-G load. The combination of AGSM and a modern G-suit is the standard high-end defense package for modern fighter pilots, and the suit prevents the gross blood pooling pattern from developing at full force, while AGSM supplies the mechanical pressure for the central circulation during the brief periods when the suit's compression is insufficient. Pilot training in centrifuges emphasizes the integrated use of both because either defense alone is significantly less effective than the combination. And the training pipeline is rigorous because failures of integration are catastrophic and recoverable only through prompt recovery from G-LOC before controlled flight is lost by the incapacitated aircraft. Even with both defenses, the brain's blood supply can drop sufficiently to lose function, and the progression is documented in detail. Peripheral vision dims first, the field narrows progressively towards central vision dims, and finally unconsciousness ensues unless the pilot is able to unload the aircraft or otherwise end the sustained high-G condition before that progression completes. The recovery phase from G-LOC is itself violent and is the part most non-pilots never hear about. As the aircraft transitions out of the high-G load, the gravitational vector stops pulling blood out of the brain and cerebral perfusion returns within seconds. The internal organs that were displaced and compressed under load return toward their resting positions in a snapback that produces a proprioceptive jolt that pilots describe as disorienting and even painful in the most severe cases. There is also a brief period of cognitive impairment as cerebral oxygen debt is repaid, during which the pilot's reaction time is degraded and the pilot's situational awareness is below baseline. And this is the reason the most dangerous moment in a high-G encounter is often not the moment of gray out, but the several seconds after a G-LOC episode ends, when the pilot must regain control of the aircraft through a slow and uncertain cognitive recovery. A subset of pilots experience myoclonic jerks during the recovery phase, which are involuntary muscle contractions that can complicate the immediate task of regaining control of the aircraft. And the literature documents that the average recovery time is in the range of 10 to 20 seconds before the pilot is capable of effective control input on the flight controls. The fifth and final part of this story is about the threshold of neurological failure and what the long-term career effects of repeated high-G exposure look like for fighter pilots who make this their profession. At the ceiling of human G tolerance, the brain stops receiving enough oxygenated blood to maintain function. And this is the G-LOC event in its purest form. Not a structural failure of any one part of the brain, but a functional failure of the perfusion system that supplies the whole brain with the oxygen it needs to keep running. The pilot does not immediately experience pain or alarm in this state because consciousness withdraws smoothly within a window of approximately 5 to 10 seconds of inadequate cerebral perfusion. And in that window, the aircraft continues to respond to the pilot's last control inputs, or to gravity and aerodynamic forces if no input is being made. And the pilot's body, now limp in the harness, offers no further corrective force. The pilot's head returns to a more upright posture as the aircraft's attitude changes, or as the maneuver ends. Cerebral perfusion resumes within seconds, and consciousness returns within a few more seconds, followed by a period of confusion, partial amnesia, and degraded motor control that the literature documents in detail. Long-term cellular and structural consequences of repeated high-G exposure remain an active research area, and cognitive studies on career fighter pilots suggest no major population-level decrement from a service career of normal pattern high-G exposure, with the important qualification that individual variation is substantial, and that some pilots show measurable effects where others do not. There is evidence that repeated high-G maneuvering accelerates certain spinal disc degeneration patterns, particularly in the cervical and lumbar spine, which is consistent with the mechanical loading the axial skeleton is exposed to during peak G onset, and which can shorten a flying career in measurable ways. There is also evidence of microvascular and connective tissue changes that may accumulate over a career in ways that affect long-term musculoskeletal health, though the long-term clinical significance of these changes is still being studied in longitudinal cohorts of retired fighter pilots. Pushing beyond current human tolerance limits is increasingly in the domain of autonomous systems, because modern unmanned combat aerial vehicles and the increasingly autonomous aspects of next-generation crewed aircraft can both exceed human G ceilings by removing the human from the acceleration environment entirely. The current directional trend in fighter aviation is toward optionally crewed or pilot-assisted autonomous platforms for the highest G mission profiles, while preserving human judgment for the most decision-intensive phases of tactical flight. And this trajectory is shaped directly by the biological ceiling that human physiology imposes on the most demanding maneuver regimes that the airframes themselves can physically reach. This means that the future of combat aviation is being shaped not just by sensors and weapons and stealth, but also by a half-millennia-old constraint written into the human cardiovascular system. And that constraint is something that no amount of training or equipment can fully overcome. If this changed how you think about what pilots actually do in the cockpit, the next video dives into an ancient Japanese wood-burning technique that makes lumber fireproof without using any modern chemistry at all. And we will torch cedar planks in real time to see if char really is a better fire barrier than anything the chemical industry is selling. So tap through and watch that one next. Next,